Don't you wanna bet that I can get you back inside your head before the summer ends and spread a little love? Just for a little fun, I'll make you come back to me before the rise of every sun. Baby, it's meant to be, I know you got a man, but he don't understand. You're gonna be a heartbreaker. You're such a love taker. So just suck me in and you can toss me like a cigarette. 'Cause I just wanna be a bad habit, yeah.
Welcome to Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit, and now here's your host, Rich Barris.
Hey everyone, welcome to Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit on Monday. Told you. Today we're at least going to do an hour. Let's see, because I want to have somebody on to talk about it, to talk about what the topic of the show is today. And you know him, you love him. But let's see if we can get him on, because many of you probably don't know this. He is, in fact, a historian. And in fact, used to teach history to our monstrous generation of young little, I guess it depends what grade you get. But this is why teaching is so important, all right? And while we're talking this quarter, this entire theme, and probably beyond, about why people believe things that are not true, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, right? These cognitive biases, right? These social experiences we all have that inform our belief systems. And it is through those belief systems that we are told these stories, and we come to believe what we come to believe, and how difficult it is for us to change our minds once we go through that process. All right. Without a doubt, this isn't something people don't know, that are in these fields, of interest, right? And one of them, of course, is history. You retell a story in order to bury someone's history. You retell it in a different way. You revise it. You tell it in some another fashion so that a future generation basically hears it the wrong way. It's basically akin to the same thing ISIS was trying to accomplish when they were destroying artifacts at Nimrud and other places like that. You're erasing the history, or in this case, because it's so fresh, we're still talking about a living memory, right? That we're actually trying to revise it and retell it in a different light before it goes away altogether. All right, so before we get into this, let's talk about the concept, what's going on. And then we're going to go through a couple of different people who have made splashes, making arguments over this issue. So let's run the clip first. Let me get out of here. This is the trailer for the 1619 Project, which is running on Hulu right now. There is nothing wrong with remembering the darker aspects to one's history. In fact, it should be encouraged. All right. But there is something wrong when you remember it incorrectly. All right. There's nothing wrong with telling it from a different point of view. But while you do, and you're trying to introduce people, others, let's say, to someone else's experience, an experience of an other, right? Then we still need to keep the general facts about different time periods in place. It's okay to say how those events may have impacted others in a way that maybe you have not thought about, but it is not okay to wholly rewrite history into something it is not. All right, so let's do the trailer, and then you'll get the idea of the 1619 Project.
They say our people were born on the water, like nothing had existed before.
The New York Times published
the 1619 Project.
The legacy of slavery.
We were told by virtue of our bondage, we could never be American. But it was by virtue of our bondage that we became the most American of all.
People!
You cannot tell the story of America without telling the story of Black America.
Let's all stand together.
We are the story of America. This is the 1619 Project.
So I actually agree with that statement that you cannot tell the story of America without telling the story of Black America. There's a very provocative statement in there off the jump by Miss Jones that basically says, we were told we cannot be Americans, but we ended up being the most American. As I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about the discussion we had in the book club yesterday on Sunday, the People's Pundit Book Club on Locals. If you're not a member or not a member of the book club, you have to be a supporter on Locals, but definitely think about signing up, because this is exactly what we're talking about as we get through Jack Snyder, and we're in international relations, right? And now we're going through John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. We were discussing where it is that we go next, and I actually suggested that one of the top books that I'm thinking about reading right now is from an author that takes, well, he's gone now. He just passed away recently, but his students, his most vehement students, are the most critical of the 1619 Project because of a central claim that it makes. All right. But we're talking, of course, about The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailey. All right. Which we're going to talk about in a second. All right. But we were discussing this in the book club yesterday about where to go after this, because we were discussing the concept of nation and how Peltola and others, their definition of nation really wasn't sufficient enough after the creation of America, because we are all from different backgrounds, right? So what makes it? Is it just similar borders? Is it just similar culture? Is it just similar language? And when you look at somebody like Benedict Anderson, who wrote Imagine Communities, which he is the authority on nationhood now, I would say. I think that's a fair statement, at least in academia. It's more than that, because when he's looking at the American experience, he says, these people are from different backgrounds, but yet they're still held together by something, right? And there has to be a shared experience here with shared beliefs. And that is at the core of the claim by the 1619 Project right now. And that's why it is such a, if it's false, it's a dangerous falsehood. And if so, did they push it on purpose? Is this intentional? All right. And of course, that claim is that the American Revolution was started over slavery. Generally, there's a revisionist school out there that argues that the American Revolution was not a revolution of ideas. It was a revolution based on economic concerns. At the forefront of it all was slavery. All right, before I get into my own arguments on this, we'll look at some of the disputes on that. All right, but why is this so problematic? Because if you believe Anderson, then you believe that to be an American is the most American than any. I'm not sure that that's a valid claim. I don't know how you could be. I don't know how all Americans, if you are an American and you understand what that means, these central beliefs that we hold that are so different from any other nation state since the age of reason, or any period ever in history. If you believe in those ideals, then making statements like one is more American than the other is significantly, it's a problem. It's problematic, because immediately you're running contrary to those belief systems. And it's really the antithesis of what the point of the American experiment was supposed to be. And if you're arguing that the revolution is not a revolution of ideas, then it means the American national identity is nothing. There is no American national identity. And I think that if you're going to make a big, bold statement like that, you better be able to back it up. Unfortunately, well, before we get into it, this is the thing with history. It's a lot like polling. It better be accurate. Anyone who's accounting for it, but damn sure and better make sure that they're accurate. Because reading books that are someone else's take on history is not real academic research. I don't know how else to put this. Poring over, spending hours upon hours, poring over primary source documents. In the case of the revolution, we're talking about pamphlets. We're talking about letters to each other. We're talking about essays that were written by those that are well-known founders and those who are not so well-known founders, and finding this common strain that held them all together. immediately this claim, before we get into what people like Gordon Wood had to say about this, who wrote, by the way, is a book by Gordon Wood. And we can show you how many books Gordon Wood has written. This is a book, The American Revolution, Essays on the American Revolution. This isn't Gordon Wood's opinion. This is Gordon Wood simply laying out letter after letter, pamphlet after pamphlet, account after account, diary entry after diary entry, right? And then you have others who did, like John Rodham, who did similar things. The American writings from the American Revolution, fantastic. Amazingly, in one of his is a letter and about the British enlisting the help of slaves to fight against the colonists. And by the way, in that letter, you will hear how it's vice versa. People who want to tell this story often blur the lines between decades. All right. So the treatment of African Americans in early America, you would not, if you poured over these primary sources, you would not see that this was something that was consistent all the time in the light. So, for instance, the way it was in antebellum America, in pre-war, pre-Civil War America, you would not have found those same conditions in the colonies. Just like, for instance, post-Civil War, you would not, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, find those conditions to be the same as you would have found them fast forward a couple of decades when we get into the Jim Crow era, because things happened during these periods of time that changed conditions for Black Americans in this country. And we often like to basically just leave them out. In modern discourse, which we talk a lot about in our Virtuous Republic, I talk a lot about this. They want you to like skip from the Civil War right into Jim Crow, as if there wasn't this period of Reconstruction, right? And there weren't all of these issues between the North and the South that probably would not have happened if Lincoln was not assassinated. Not probably. If Lincoln was not assassinated, would not have happened. Lincoln did not want to punish the South, yet he was killed. And leadership was not great after Lincoln was assassinated. We went from one incompetent president to another, a drunk president to a corrupt president, and they lost control of Reconstruction. And it ended up being this endless wave of progressives that wanted to beat down the South. And they did, with things like taxes that funded their pension programs, the Grand Army of the Republic pension program, which is the final straw for the Southern man who just was told that if we surrender, we will just end up being reinstituted in the Union, and well, we're going to go on as Mr. Lincoln said we were going to go on. That's not what happened. And Northern officers marched through the South and torched people's farms and seized them. And I'm not saying it's like, oh, poor South, after what I'm telling you, this is what happened. And that led to the rise of popular, at that time, dissonant voices who are arguing that the South needs to rise again. And they are known as redeemer governments. They were Democrats, by the way. And they instituted what we now know to be Jim Crow laws all throughout the South. It was not like that immediately after the war. It was a reaction to being punished for the Civil War. All right, so this is what and it's not all out yet, but I mean, just judging from everything that's said and the things that you can already see in the early episodes, they are misconstruing or obfuscating, and I'm getting the idea that this is intentional. They are intentionally obfuscating periods within the American Republic, especially the early Republic, with the sole purpose of rewriting how this story played out. All right, so let's look first at somebody who immediately jumped out, and I can't. It's not that I'm a huge fan of this guy, so he's not even the one who's making the argument out of whole cloth. But absent reading you an entire book by Gordon Wood, I think he did a good job of explaining why people like Gordon Wood, why Bernard Balin and others not just take issue. I mean, folks, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. It's not like this all there's a little bit of truth in each. There's not. One is right, one is wrong, period. The problem with the central claim is part of the colonies didn't even rely on slavery. The most fervent Protestants who were patriots, who were pro-independence, didn't even rely on slavery for their economy. So immediately you have a major problem. In fact, it was some of the slave economies, the slave-built economies, earned so much money from the crown. That's why they needed Virginia on board. That's why Massachusetts needed Virginia to come on board. Because that would have pulled, they were the mother colony. And that would have pulled some of the other, slave economies in the South over to their side. All right, so I'm getting painting a broad picture here, but let's get into something that honestly, it's sad, because I think a lot of kids are taught to hate the founders and look at them as nothing but slave-owning racists. And this is a major, first, it's false. I mean, of course, founders had slaves, but it's a very broad brush that's been unfairly painted. And because of it, I think a lot of younger generations of Americans have wholly forgotten their history. And that's sad. And it's okay to talk. Again, it would have been perfectly fine to highlight the history of Black Americans' plights and advancements, right? Because you have the right, who always wants to talk about only the advancements. And then you have the left, who always wants to talk about the grievances. And the fair historian who's trying to be productive to society is going to try to do both, right? You don't want to forget these things. Again, talking about Anderson, Imagine Communities, shared glory and shared suffering. You don't want to forget these things. Otherwise, the boundaries of your nation, which are imagined communities, the boundaries of your nation begin to crumble. All right. So immediately you had people like George Will, who is not a historian. All right. He writes, the malicious, historically illiterate 1619 project keeps rolling on. And this is over a year ago. But I think it's one of the most important ones. It originally ran in the Washington Post, but I'm showing you a reprint here because you know how I feel about the Washington Post. All right, the New York Times is like God, who, if Genesis reported creation correctly, beheld his handiwork and decided it was very good. The Times is comparably pleased with itself concerning its creation, the 1619 project. This began in August 2019 as a special edition of the paper's Sunday magazine. Now it has become a book by which the Times continues attempting to, quote, reframe, unquote, U.S. history. In the Times, an advertisement for the Times book describes it, quote, as a dramatic expansion of a groundbreaking work of journalism, unquote. That description damages journalism's reputation for respecting facts, which the 2019 writing that got this book did not do. The 1619 projects tendentiously reeks of political purpose. The Times' original splashy assertion, slightly fudged after the splash garnered a Pulitzer Prize, of course it did, was that the American Revolution, the most important event in our history, was shameful because the primary reason it was fought was to preserve slavery. Now that, hold on, before we go any further, I want to read you something. This is the textbook definition of revisionist. When the ideological origins of the American Revolution was published, all right, by Bernard Bailyn, which argues that it was a revolution of ideas. And by the way, those ideas at the time were very revolutionary, meaning radical, all right, to their core. When it was first written, all right, and it was Harvard University Press. It was 1967, reprint 1992, updated for another edition. And then in 92, the Times wrote this of the ideological origins of the American Revolution. One cannot claim to understand the revolution without having read this book. Simple. They found it to be so insightful, they declared that you can't understand the American Revolution unless you read Bernard Bailyn's book. Now, here we are. This isn't building on something you say is so pivotal, so key, so central, so consequential to understanding the revolution. This isn't something that's built on that body of work and expanding on it, as they are kind of alluding to in their review. This is something that is wholly challenging everything that Bernard Bailyn's book argues. The war was supposedly ignited by a November 1775 British offer of freedom to blacks who fled slavery and joined British forces. Well, that offer came after increasingly volcanic American reactions to various British provocations. After the 1765 Stamp Act, after the 1770 Boston Massacre, after the 1773 Boston Tea Party, after the 1774 coercive acts, including closure of Boston's port, and other events of the, quote, the long year of revolution, which is the subtitle of Mary Beth Norton's 1774. And after, in 1775, the April 19 battles of Lexington and Concord, the June 17th battle of Bunker Hill, and George Washington on July 3rd assuming command of the Continental Army. Ladies and gentlemen, did you understand the timeline that I just read to you? The 1619 Project is claiming that British attempts to free slaves in the colonies sparked the revolution, even though the official offer came after the Tea Party, after the coercive acts, after the... folks, Washington called, because there were parts of legislation, that one of them being that no longer could a colonist who was committed of a serious crime be tried by a jury of their own peers. Oh no, they would be put on a ship, His Royal Majesty's ship, ferried across the Atlantic, and tried in front of a bunch of British loyalists. Washington called it the Murderous Act. After that, after the events of the Long Year of Revolution, which is a seminal book, again, written by Mary Beth Norton in 1774, which describes how these series of events played out, and why, by the way, and why. After the battles of Lexington and Concord. This is asinine. Even if the timeline didn't make sense, would it still be true? Even though I just explained to you that some of these colonies couldn't have given a whit about the slave trade. They were not reliant on them. Written history is not like doing physics, but event A cannot have caused event B if B began before A. Addressing the American Council of Trustees and Alumni last month, Gordon S. Wood, who, by the way, for those of you who were at the book club yesterday, we talked about Wood. We talked about the Glorious Cause, which was Robert Middlecoff's book. It's like the Bible. I mean, it's so big. Why? Because it has so many primary source documents in. We talked about Richard Brown, Major Problems in the Era of the American Revolution. And by the way, this is how big, before we go any further, this is how big the Glorious Cause is. Filled with primary source documents. And by the way, this has nothing to do with the revolution. I just want to briefly tell you a book suggestion, What Blood Won't Tell, certainly written by a liberal, okay, a liberal historian without a doubt, but gives you a great feel for how these revisionists obscure the timeline in order to convince you that they're right, that their version of history is correct. We're going to read an article from another, not right-winger. I mean, that woman attacks Dinesh D'Souza on page 300 for a buck. His take on race and history and why, modern policy, how we can't move forward by just clearly saying, things are better now. She doesn't hold views that some right-wing historian holds. But her argument is that the treatment of slaves and the treatment of African Americans is not the same thing in the early, throughout the early republic and throughout the period of antebellum Civil War period, pre-war period. They're not the same. What Blood Won't Tell. And how does she do this, by the way? By pulling court records, texts from magistrates who heard complaints that wound up punishing masters. Now, without a doubt, not everyone, not every slave was lucky enough to get such a thing, but surely not the history you've been told. Not the entire picture. All right, but getting back to events A cannot cause event B if event B began before event A. Anyway, addressing the American Council of Trustees and Alumni last month, which was actually November of 2021, Gordon Wood, today's foremost scholar of America's founding, dissected the 1619 Project's contentions. Is that claim true by George Will? Yes, absolutely. And that's why I'm hoping, David jumps on. But anyone who studies history in any academic setting, when it comes to the American Revolution, Gordon Wood is it. I don't know if I'd call Bernard Bailyn his mentor. Surely had a major influence on him. But the fact of the matter is, Gordon Wood, took Bailyn's work into another level. Now, Gordon Wood, and that would be fair to say, like the New York Times Review tried to claim, it would be fair to say that Gordon Wood took a Bailyn's masterpiece and expanded on it from there. Because we're talking about their scholarship is consistent with each other. It's in the same, they're not disputing central facts about the events that they're studying. They're not trying to rewrite something that rewrite something that did happen into something that did not. Anyway, he said when the revolution erupted, Britain, quote, was not threatening to abolish slavery in its empire, unquote, which included lucrative slavery-dependent sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean. Wood added, if the Virginian slaveholders had been frightened of British abolitionism, why only 8 years after the war ended would the Board of Visitors or the trustees of the College of William and Mary in Virginia, wealthy slaveholders, all of them, award an honorary degree to Granville Sharp, the leading British abolitionist at the time? Had they changed their minds so quickly? The New York Times has no accurate knowledge of Virginia's revolutionary culture and cannot begin to answer these questions. Because they don't. He's right. The Times' political agenda requires ignoring what Wood knows. Again, quote, this is something that's true but controversial, and again, we explore in our Virtuous Republic. This idea that that our founders were all like racist slaveholders who wanted to preserve slavery forever is simply false. The most fervent abolitionists were in the colonies. It was the American colonists who were interested in abolitionism in 1776. Not only were the northern states the first slaveholding governments in the world to abolish slavery, but the United States became the first nation in the world to begin actively suppressing the despicable international slave trade. The New York Times has the history completely backwards. Folks, when Jefferson and Franklin and Adams were hatching out what Jefferson was writing before declaring independence, do you think it was an accident that they put those words in there? They toned down Jefferson's first draft, apparently, but Jefferson from Virginia, a slaveholder. Wood's doctoral dissertation advisor in 1960 to 1964 was Bernard Bailyn, the title of whose best-known book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, conveys a refutation of the 1619 Project's premise that the revolution originated from base economic motives. Understand, before we go on, understand that there was already a movement of historians attempting to revise this concept of the cause of the American Revolution into economic ones. And not all of it had to do with slavery. So when Bernard Bailyn wrote this book, he wasn't just refuting people who were trying to claim that slavery was essential economic, or even the chief economic concern. There were many economic arguments. And when Bernard Bailyn wrote The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, he basically bent these people over his knee and gave them a walloping. Why? Because when you do what these gentlemen do, and you open up, well, first of all, let me just put this not nicely. When you stop being lazy, and you go through all of the primary source documents yourself instead of relying on somebody else to tell you a story. Look, they're not easy to read. They're not easy to read. But when you do, you start to actually feel like you can get to know somebody. You find a certain intimacy. All right? And you start to get to the central feelings. On 124 in this one, I want to grab a letter from Adams to Abigail. As many of you probably do know, John Adams confided in his wife quite a bit. And after Congress voted to declare independence, it's funny. There's basically not a single mention of any economic concern whatsoever. There's a lot about devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be commemorated. All right? This is what he says. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells. Guns, by the way. Guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. That's funny. I'm not really seeing anything about making sure the slave trade is preserved. Hold on, let me read over it one more time. There's no mention of slavery at all in this letter. That's odd. What about General Washington? His first letter after the Congress voted to votes for independence. His letter to Joseph Reed. Or James Patterson, excuse me, is meeting Joseph Reed, took a memorandum on the meeting. That's funny. There's nothing to do with it. That's crazy. That can't be right. All right, when Bailyn died a year after the 1619 Project was launched, the Times obituary noted that he had challenged the progressive era historians who saw the founders' revolutionary rhetoric as a mask for economic interests. Actually, the rhetoric gave momentum to ideas that were the revolution. Right. It wasn't that he challenged them. There's really been nobody who could unchallenge. No, there's nobody who put forward a counter challenge to Bailyn that is more convincing. Because when you pore over the documents of these people, that's not their central concern. Every single one of these books, don't take my word for it. You should do it. You should do it yourself. Put the work in yourself. Don't take the word of the 1619 Project, and don't take the word of the People's Pundit. Read the books of these men. Again, one, The Glorious Cause, Robert Middlecoff. It's huge, but it's also huge in its scholarship. Bernard Bailyn is a must-read. The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. Which, by the way, he brings into this idea of, the Protestant ethic and, concepts of that came out of the Age of Reason. You can trace these thoughts, this school of thought that really informed all of them. Some people were more focused on natural law arguments, philosophical arguments about natural law having to do with liberty and what a social contract really should be. That, Jefferson, if you read his letter, which was a last-ditch effort to appeal to the king, which is another falsehood, by the way. The colonists viewed the king as like their dad. And he made one last pitch to them. Dad, save us from this crazy tyrannical parliament. Yes, the king later became the figure of, their hate, all, colonial hatred, and the target of propaganda. I mean, that's really what it was, to get patriotism running high. But when they were discussing whether or not to break away and declare independence, he was their last hope. If you read that, it reads like the Declaration of Independence. If you read John Adams, you hear Cicero between every sentence. He was more concerned about what Cicero called the true law, what the founders called natural law. But he was looking at it from a lawyer's point of view. Is there some kind of precedent in legal philosophy? He was looking at it like he was going to argue for independence before a judge. They all had their different styles, but what Balin beautifully does is draw from all of them and say this is where they all meet. And these are the ideological origins of the revolution. This is what fueled their shared radical beliefs. And which, by the way, were so strong that it pulled in slave colonies that made a fortune off the crown. Yeah, and again, he just goes on to say that the 1619 project may be embedded in school curricula near you. Of course it is, and we know this. We've been in this. All of these people are trashing Ron DeSantis. That's what Dan Rather was talking about the other day when I went after him on Twitter, and I basically said, yes, I meant that the country will be better off when Dan Rather and the rest of them are gone. I'm not kidding, and by gone, I mean no longer with us. Generational changes. These are people who have been living off this grift for decades. And we're never going to move forward while they're still on this earth. It's a generational problem. It's sad, but that's just the reality of it. What was that, Laura? It's their paycheck, Laura. It's their claim to fame. It's why same reason Bob Woodward and Bernstein can't stop talking about Watergate. Their claim to fame was this period of civil rights, which, by the way, they take credit for when they really have no credit to take. Ron DeSantis doesn't want falsehoods being taught to the children in his state. A falsehood that's dangerous, by the way. You're telling the kids that their beloved country was created out of hatred, out of evils, to preserve evils. That's dangerous enough. The second part of this, why this is so dangerous, is, again, when you lose those shared histories. You lose the imagined community. And that is central to holding nationhood together. And the third, of course, is that the ideas that were the American Revolution are so precious to human liberty that if you forget them, which is why I called it the forgotten clause in the American social contract, when you forget them, humanity is going to suffer. They're going to pay for it. We invented the modern concept of citizenship. It's a difference between a citizen and personhood, or a subject. Roman citizens were not citizens as we understand the concept now. But you can't have that concept if you no longer believe in the ideals that sparked the revolution. In Woods' words, the 1619 Project aims to erased the revolution and the principles that it articulated: liberty, equality, and the well-being of ordinary people. He gets it. You may think what I said is hyperbolic. It's not. The human condition will suffer if these revisionists win. They will. If they win the battle for the minds of people and the future generations, that are to come, the human condition will degrade. The concept of citizenship as we know it today could be lost forever. And they would argue, well, we're the ones who believe in equality. You're the ones, and so you just want to suppress certain communities forever. Should I run the clip again? We're the most American. We ended up being the most American. We were told that we couldn't be American. And then we ended up being the most American. Somebody who does not truly understand the concept of equality could only make such a statement. Right? Laura's in the other room laughing. It's the truth. You can't claim to be more American and believe in equality. You can't even claim to know what it is to be an American. If you claim that, right? I mean, that's nuts. It goes against everything that the American Revolution was trying to preserve. If it is the agenda of clearing away all impediments, intellectual and institutional, to, in the progressivism's vocabulary, the transformation of the nation. Right, so the next point is, and let's get it, the Times says, quote, nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional, unquote, flows from, quote again, slavery and the anti-black racism it required. My God. I think Max Weber, who probably better than anybody put a definition to capitalism in the Americas better than anybody, would have a serious problem with that statement. Capitalism is not at all what you think it is. It's not the pursuit of wealth, greed for wealth's sake. We've always had that. In antiquity, we had that. That isn't new. But again, and there's a warning in the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism where Max Weber basically says, you better teach this in the kindergartens across the nations. Otherwise, you're going to forget. And in fact, clearly we have. If you ask people to define capitalism today, do you think that they would understand any idea of the Protestant ethic? The calling, frugality, these concepts our founders believed in? No, absolutely not. So this is their next step here. The anti-black racism it required. Natural law? I mean, they do realize that in the founding documents, they ended slavery by default. They just chose, they chose to kick the can down the road. As, speaking of Adams, told Abigail. You cannot tear the fabric of society apart right now with, by doing things like that. And by the way, when it comes to women, your time will come as well. But we're upending the order. And if we push too hard, we could destroy what has been a delicate peace. But they planted the seeds for women's suffrage, and they planted the seeds for abolition all throughout the founding documents and all throughout how they designed the government. This is what Wood is saying that's controversial, that people don't want to understand. In fact, it was, and this is like nowadays, the media, the entertainment industry, they view like mainstream, mainline Protestants backwards, especially if they're in the South and they're evangelical, right? When in fact, they were the ones who had the most fire in their hearts for abolition back then. And it would be the churches of different Protestant denominations that would eventually demand women's suffrage. It's just nuts. Martin Luther King relied on that kind of faith-based activism in order to get his message through in the civil rights era. He was literally standing on their shoulders to do it. Anyway, this is where we're going to go next, though. So the 1619 Project's historical illiteracy is not innocent ignorance. And he claims that based on this, the Times saying that. And I want to explore that a little bit because this claim is not true. It's not. And again, you could take my word for it. I'd really rather you not. I'd rather you pick up Bernard Bailyn. I'd rather you pick up any one of these books, and I'm going to show you how many there are. I'll even give you one that has a lot of primary stuff in it. The Glorious Cause. Look at how big this thing is. I couldn't put this thing down. I mean, of course he's guiding you through, but he's showing you in their own words, okay? Same thing with Wood, same thing with Bailyn. That's what they do. That's their point, that's what they're doing. Wood has written a lot of literature on the American Revolution. Here's Amazon right here. The Creation of the American Republic is fantastic. I just couldn't dig it up. I think it's in a tote somewhere. I'm serious because we have so many books out. He has so many amazing, published work. Power and Liberty is also very good. But if you want to get insight, The Radicalism of the American Revolution is another one. That's an audiobook right there. This is cool if you want to get to know the founders better, who they were. And again, you do that when you read a man's letters back and forth to his friends and his wife. You get a sense of who that man is in his heart, what he truly thinks about, in his mind day in and day out, what worries him, his hopes for the future, his fears. So again, or you can take the word of a documentary filmmaker who has apparently a lot of people, and this is where I want to go next. So I want to see whether or not we can support George Will's assertion that this was on purpose. This is a lie, and this is a lie being told on purpose with intent, right? To transform, to make people hate their own history, to tell a story that's a fiction, to manipulate the minds of people, right, Laura? Which is ultimately our theme. Is this an attempt to manipulate minds? Is this part of the information war? All right, so let's look at an article I found, which I found to be something. This is not exactly Fox News, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? This is Politico magazine, the history department. Hold on, let me take a quick. Possible I could trouble you for a water, Laura? Or even better, a Field of Greens mix or something? I know, I'll stir it. You could put it in a damn cup. I don't care. Put it in a cup of water and I'll stir it myself. Thank you. She's fantastic. All right, so I helped fact check the 1619 Project. The Times ignored me. The paper's series on slavery made avoidable mistakes, but the attacks from its critics are much more dangerous. And I read that on purpose. This is not, again, a right-wing historian. And they actually expressed concern, as you'll see. Leslie Harris expressed concern with the critics denouncing the 1619 Project's claim about the American Revolution, but then ignoring what could be positive contributions from the work to help you understand the Black experience. And I would worry about that too. I do. Like I said, I think that there is absolutely room for white America to open their eyes to the Black experience. I say that as somebody who was not raised and sheltered in white America. I probably have more ghetto time than most politicians who represent urban areas. No kidding. This is their fault, however. You can't blame the critics after you make, it's not just that they made avoidable errors. They're making a monumental claim that is false. And the evidence suggests they know it's false. They don't care. They're doing this on purpose. So here is somebody who, Paul Hannah-Jones, and basically the New York Times in general had enlisted a lot of different historians to come on board and help them do this, help fact check whether or not what Nikole Hannah-Jones was putting into this body of work, help fact check, these claims. When they were told that these claims weren't true, including the central claim that we are taking issue with, they didn't care. And it means it wasn't just Gordon Wood, who they would look at as a white guy. He's just some white historian, right? With a bunch of Uncle Tom acolytes. That's how these people would think about this. This is a left-winger who specializes in slavery and the history of African Americans in the early republic in America from 1626 to 1863 in New York City specifically. And I think that her contribution and her comments here are really significant and important because she knows what Gordon Wood knows, which is that there was a lot of abolition fever in New York, in Pennsylvania, even in New Jersey, where you could find more slaves. There were whole societies. That's how Ben Franklin gets his association with the Quakers. He was just running with these people. Why? Because he was trying to push anti-slavery sentiment in different sects. Leslie M. Harris is professor of history at Northwestern University and author of In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, and Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies. All right. Oh, man, this is going to be good. Let me just take a swab of Field of Greens first, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know about you, Laura, but at this point, I'm starting to crave this. I miss a day, I feel the difference. I kid you not. All right, on August 19th of last year. Are you trying to tell me something or? Oh, okay. On August 19th of last year, I listened in stunned silence as Nikole Hannah-Jones, a reporter for the New York Times, repeated an idea that I had vigorously argued against with her fact checker. That the Patriots fought the American Revolution in large part to preserve slavery in North America. Hannah-Jones and I were on Georgia Public Radio to discuss the path-breaking New York Times 1619 project, a major feature about the impact of slavery on American history, which she had spearheaded. The Times had just published a special 1619 edition of its magazine. You remember that when that happened, folks. Which led, by the way, Ron DeSantis to eventually ban this stuff from the curriculum. Which took its name from the year 20 Africans arrived in the colony of Virginia, a group believed to be the first enslaved Africans to arrive in British North America. Weeks before, I had received an email from a New York Times research editor. Because I'm an historian of African American life and slavery in New York specifically, and the pre-war era more generally, she wanted me to verify some statements for the project. At one point, she sent me this assertion. Hang tight. One critical reason, as a quote, excuse me. This is the assertion. One critical reason that the colonists declared their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery in the colonies, which had produced tremendous wealth. Oh my God. At the time, there were growing calls to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, which would have badly damaged the economies of colonies in both North and South. Understand, of course, there was an economic impact to the northern colonies from the abolition of slavery still at that point, but we're not talking about badly damaged the economies of the North. I don't think you could really support that statement. Not in, by the time we get to, we're on the cusp of industrialization. By the time you get to the the war for independence, I really, I don't believe that. I don't buy that argument. I vigorously disputed the claim, she said. Although slavery was certainly an issue in the American Revolution, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons the 13 colonies went to war. Again, this is not a right-wing historian. This is someone who specializes in the Black experience in the Americas. Again, from 1626 to 1863, she wrote a book on African Americans in New York City from 1626 to 1863. And again, is generally a that's her field of specialty. More generally speaking, not just New York, is specific to New York, but which I think again is more valuable here. The editor followed up with several questions probing the nature of slavery in the colonial era, such as whether enslaved people were allowed to read, could legally marry, could congregate in groups of more than 4, and could own, will, or inherit property. The answers to which, this is something anybody who's really ever studied American history, especially on this is where, remember what I said in the beginning about obfuscating things, obfuscating the timeline, right? Anyone who knows anything would read this request and say, this person knows nothing about American history. The answers to these questions widely depend on the era and the colony. This is somebody who asked this question, is somebody who has been indoctrinated with the general left-wing revisionist belief that it's this, again, very broad brush being painted all over 13 colonies, over every historical figure, over every single time period in the early republic. This is just not true. I explained these histories as best I could, with references to specific examples, but never heard back from her about how the information would be used. Despite my advice, the Times published the incorrect statement about the American Revolution anyway in Hannah Jones's introductory essay, which I will not click on. In addition, the paper's characterizations of slavery in early America reflected laws and practices more common in the antebellum era than in colonial times, and did not accurately illustrate the varied experiences of the first generation of enslaved people that arrived in Virginia in 1619. This is what I'm trying to say. And again, people are always afraid to say it because they don't want to be labeled as somebody who's like discounting the horrors of slavery. All right, but the truth of the matter is the picture that you have in your head about the slaveholding South pre-war antebellum era is not accurate across the timeline. It's not. And the picture you have in your head about the civil rights struggle in the 50s, the 60s is not accurate across the timeline post-Civil War. It's not. It's already bad enough. Why? Right. This is what I can't stand about Hollywood, Laura. Oh, this is their friends, though, in like Hollywood. They take a real story and they embellish the shit out of it as if it's already not good enough.
The situation was horrible to begin with.
Yeah, you don't need to embellish it. Anyway, both sets of inaccuracies worried me. But the Revolutionary War statement made me especially anxious. Overall, the 1619 Project is a much-needed corrective to the blindly celebratory histories that once dominated our understanding of the past. Histories that wrongly suggested racism and slavery were not a central part of U.S. history. I was concerned that critics would use the overstated claim to discredit the entire undertaking. So far, that's exactly what has happened. But Laura, that's on them. You know what I mean? So because they did what you just said, that's on them. It's not white America's fault. It's not Ron DeSantis' fault. It's not Donald Trump's fault. It's not Dinesh D'Souza's fault. And it's not my fault. It's not George Will's fault. It's not Gordon Wood's fault. It's Hannah Jones's fault. It's a major claim. You cannot start off this piece with a major claim that is a lie. And obviously an intentional lie, because they didn't take Gordon Wood's advice. They didn't take her advice. That's right. It's to incite anger, Laura. It's to rewrite history. And it's to change, unfortunately, it's to change your understanding of what it means to be an American. Because the dirty little secret is this. They don't care. Leftists don't care if something is a direct threat to the national identity. Because they hate nationalism. They want you to think it's a dirty word. Nationalism, unfortunately, for the great collective Marxists of the 20th century, proved to be their what's that word when you have a Batman's Joker? What's the word, right? So, nemesis. Nationalism proved to be Marxism's and leftism's greatest nemesis all throughout the 20th century. And again, the book club, we had this conversation yesterday. Why couldn't brothers in socialism come together during the Great Wars? What was more powerful? Being Russian, being a Frenchman, being British, being American, being Italian, being German, being Japanese, and on and on and on, being Polish. Nationalism is more powerful than ideology. The great Ken Waltz talks a lot about it in Man, the State, and War. Thomas Narn, the heir to Karl Marx's school of ideology, Marxist school of ideology, laments in his entire body of work about how nationalism has got to go. Otherwise, we will never be able to advance true Marxism in America or Western European countries. The nation state has got to go. The modern liberal system of nation states has got to be upended. So when I see right-leaning historians, left-leaning historians, and I think if you ask Gordon Wood whether it's fair to call him a right-leaning historian, he'd get pissed. History is history. It's not written for the right or the left. History is what is, Again, you're talking about somebody who spent countless hours of his life, of which we only get one, dedicating himself to pouring through the writings and the hearts of minds, peeking into the soul of these men. It is what it is. What you find in their writings, it is what it is. The central parts of this stuff is really not up for interpretation. They're pretty damn explicit. Unfortunately, I share her concerns. It would have been a good project, a valuable project. in some respects, because I absolutely believe it is true that it isn't accurate to say that racism and slavery are not a part of our history. Of course they are. Yeah. Just like it's a part of Egyptian history that they once held Jews as slaves. Just like it's a part of Italy's history that the Sicilian people were once enslaved by the Moors. I don't really see a benefit to ignoring certain parts of slavery, but what Hannah Jones is trying to do here with this central claim is no different than ISIS destroying the statues at Nimrud. It's not. The goal is the same. And that goal is to strike at a national identity and rewrite a history of the people. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable. Why didn't Sally stay in France? If Jefferson was such a racist rapist, why didn't she stay in France when she had the chance, Laura? If George Washington loved the economy of slavery so much, why did, by the way, in the colony of Virginia, which cost a fortune to set a slave free, a fortune. Why did he do that make sure that was in motion after his wife died? She's talking about making sure they had, folks, if you wanted to make one of your slaves a free man in Virginia, you needed to pay what was essentially a bond that if the slave did anything, or the new free man or woman did anything illegal or untoward, it was basically your assurance, financial assurance that they wouldn't. You needed to educate them, which came at a great cost. They needed to make sure that there would be some kind of occupation that they were trained in. You couldn't just throw an unproductive member of society into the labor force. They thought about things differently than we do now. There's no handout back then. We don't expect by the sheer fact that we're breathing that we're entitled to something. They thought a little differently back then. And some of this stuff was to make it hard. That's true. But other things like educate and train, that's the Protestant ethic at its core. You are not supposed to be a burden on society. You're not supposed to be lazy. Idle hands do the devil's work. Where do you think these sayings come from? The calling is the concept, the old school Protestant concept that whether you were a Quaker, you were a Congregationalist, like which came from the Puritans. John Adams was a Congregationalist, or you were in the Anglican Church, right? You still had these Protestant ethic beliefs. The calling is one that says God wants you to work. He wants you to produce. He does not want you to be a lazy bum. That's not okay. Lazy men do evil things. Men who have too much time on their hands fill that time with wicked stuff. You also are a waste of space in society. God wants you to work, and he wants you to earn, and he wants you to prosper, so you're not a burden on your fellow man. In fact, if one of your fellow man needs something, needs assistance, then you can be of assistance to your fellow man. So you can be charitable. That's why the other concept comes with the calling, and that concept is frugality. See, it would be great if Americans today knew this, but they don't. Because of decades and decades and decades of historians and works like the 1619 Project making stuff up out of whole cloth. These men did not pursue wealth for wealth's sake. Washington, Jefferson, do you know what they were most concerned with? Virtue. Am I a virtuous man? I mean, park for a second the conspiracy theories. The entire point of this is to be the best man you could be. At least it was for them. It wasn't to be part of some shadowy society because they were going to like conquer the world. The point is to be somebody that other men say, like Washington cared so much about his image. Do people view me as a virtuous man? How will history remember me? I think we do this man a disgusting disservice, him and everybody else, when we believe this stuff. And yeah, Howard Zinn's another one. Larry Schweikert destroyed Howard Zinn. Destroys him. That's how Larry Schweikert got some, to be, I don't know if the word's famous, but in the world of historians, Larry certainly is very well known. My buddy Larry Schweikert. We should have Larry on, man. Text him for me. I mean, the show's almost over, but I would love to just get, if he has a quick minute. I understand it's last minute, but I would love this. I mean, Glenn Beck saw his book, Larry Schweikert's book, and was like, wow, this guy destroys Howard Zinn. He does. So he gets on Glenn Beck. They do a little whiteboard presentation. It was at the height of Glenn Beck's popularity on Fox News. And that's how Larry became a New York Times bestseller. I don't know if you don't have Larry's, but I can't. And Larry, I'm sorry, I forgot to even. A Patriots History is another must read. All right. I think Larry always dives into these areas. And the Wild World of History is absolutely worth subscribing to. Larry's history lessons are incredible. You blew my mind, the one he did on the frontiersmen and their impact on the buffalo. He makes a completely different case. Like, of course, the white man hunted the buffalo and dramatically destroyed their populations. But Larry argues it was, in fact, the work of one movement, which was not a Native American movement, that ended up saving the population we have now. So, again, of course, it's always good to remember the bad, but not at the expense of the truth. Not at the expense of some of the other things that are, like those who were in history who were saying, no, this isn't right. If we do what people like Hannah Jones and the New York Times want us to do, then these people put up a fight and made these sacrifices for nothing. I don't know, folks. You're supposed to honor people in history who deserve it. You're not supposed to unfairly malign them for a political agenda. Because that's what they're doing. All right? Every damn Jefferson birthday, I gotta defend Jefferson. And in fact, I don't want to get into it right now, but that's something we should go back and read one day when I did have to defend Jefferson against these outrageous claims. Outrageous claims. All right, let's go through our reads. Word from our sponsor. And when we come back, I'm going to read some of your ideas. I'm already reading some, and some of them are really cool. All right. So, and Michael Ray is 100% right. If you go back to Michael Ray's comment from 12:39 p.m., where I see it as 12:39. Now, you guys sick of those pandemic pounds you still have? You haven't been able to get rid of? Holidays, right? Especially if you're Italian like me, boy, you put on those pounds. I got at least 5 from the holidays that I still got to get rid of. But you tried all these fad diets and they don't work. Laura and I have been there. We've done that. We've done this super beat, that pill, this diet, this workout, the fact that they just don't work. You know what does? Eating 5 healthy servings of fruits and vegetables a day. But Rich, I don't like vegetables, especially the dark greens you say are so important. I get it. And also those who say, how the hell are you supposed to eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every single day? Again, I get it. Laura and I are cookers, and we try to eat balanced meals. We don't try. We eat balanced meals. It is not feasible to do what science says you need to do for intake with fruits and vegetables. But again, that's why I want to talk to you about Field of Greens. They make it feasible and they make it tolerable. All right, especially for those who, like me, certain vegetables I'm not a fan of. I like my vegetables that I like, and I stick to them, but that's not sufficient for your diet, especially for your metabolic system. All right, so Field of Greens, I could go through all this science-backed formula, but the real proof is going to come, folks, when you get to your doctor and the doctor says, whatever you're doing, continue it. Whatever you have done to lose that weight or improve your metabolic condition, blood work, whatever, keep it up. And actually, that just happened to me last week after being on the regimen for about, I don't even know, Laura, maybe 6 weeks tops. I don't even know. So it worked quickly. It was maybe a couple weeks. So anyway, I want you to go to fieldofgreens.com. That's fieldofgreens.com. We'll get you started with 15% off using the promo code for the People's Pundit, TPP. Again, check it out. Fieldofgreens.com, promo code TPP. Get started today. You can use lemon lime like me. Obviously, the ladies seem to like the berry. I don't know, but that is definitely a thing. Laura likes the berry. Everyone who tells us they've gotten it, maybe like 2 guys got lemon lime. The rest are on berry. I personally like the lemon lime. Or you can get it unflavored and throw it in your favorite drink like Body Armor or something. And you barely notice it's there until you feel the benefits of it. All right, again, fieldofgreens.com, promo code TPP. You won't be disappointed. All right. Oh, I'm so glad he was able to hop on real quick. Short notice. I'm like going over all these Gordon Wood books, Robert Middlecoff books, and to talk about this crazy claim from the 1619 Project. And Larry Schweikert, best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author himself. I'm so thankful he gave us a couple of minutes here. Larry, my friend, welcome to the show. I'm going to go ahead and bring him on now. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time. Couldn't have thought of a better guest. Larry, you're very well known for Patriots history. I would like you to just generally speak on this claim from the 1619 Project, and what, I don't know if you're watching, how much you're watching, but it appears that the New York Times even ignored their own left-wing journalists who are experts in the Black experience. This one specifically New York, but definitely the colonies in general, from the late 1600s all the way through past the Civil War and the Reconstruction. They were telling the Times Hannah Jones's claims are not true, and the fact checker just ignored her.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I really like the Marshall stacks behind you.
Oh yeah,
that's from a real rock and roller era. If you had Marshall back in my day, it started off, if you had a Fender Bassman, you were really something. But then it got to be, you've got a Marshall stack. I mean, that was the gold standard back then. But and
pride and joys, Larry. Pride and joys.
Second of all, to Gordon Wood is the best. But if you want real extensive research, unbiased, he's a lefty, but he's pretty fair. You want to look at any of the writings of David Bryan, Brion Davis. David Bryan Davis. And he always has a title. He must have 15 books like this. The Problem of Slavery in. Problem of slavery in the ancient world, the problem of slavery in the age of revolution, the problem of slavery in the modern world, whatever it was, it's the problem of slavery in. And the guy's terrific. He's got a ton of research. So here's the bottom line of the 1619 Project. And by the way, if your viewers want to go to the wildworldofhistory.com and become a subscriber, a VIP member, I have a whole class called the 1620 default, the 1620 default, which is why we measure American exceptionalism from Plymouth in 1620, not Jamestown in 1619, because of the following reasons. Let me just quickly run over this. America is exceptional, and American exceptionalism has nothing whatsoever to do with slavery. Good, bad, or indifferent. It doesn't even play in. And the reason it doesn't is, first, everybody in the world had slavery. The estimates are that the Islamic slave trade at this time was easily higher than the whole slave trade in the American continents, both North America and South America, probably by about 6 million. The estimates are there are about 17 million slaves being traded in the Islamic world, about 11 million in the two hemispheres in the Americas. So slavery was everywhere. Indians had slavery, blacks had slavery, Africans had slavery, Muslims had slavery, Russians had slavery, Chinese had slavery. Everybody had it. It was like air. It was everywhere. So the reason we look at 1620 as the birth of American exceptionalism and not the arrival of first slaves in Virginia is that the Virginia colony that started in Jamestown in 1607 had none of the 4 pillars of American exceptionalism. Certainly didn't have 2 of them until after about 1620. But Plymouth starts in 1620 with all 4 pillars of American exceptionalism. And this is what's in my VIP series, the 1620 default. And by the way, we have 5 or 6 video series, including the Reagan series and others. But anyway, let me just give your viewers quickly the 4 pillars. The 4 pillars of American exceptionalism are that we started with a Christian, mostly Protestant religious tradition. And that only applies to Jamestown, or to Plymouth, because it was the Puritans who had a Protestant religious tradition, not the Anglicans who landed at Jamestown. They were part of the Church of England. Church of England is not a Protestant church. It was formed for one reason only, to give Henry VIII the opportunity to get a hottie. He wanted to get a divorce from Catherine, and so he said, either you give me a divorced Catholic church, or I'm going to create a new church, and I'll call it the Church of England, and I'll be in charge. It's no different structurally than the Catholic Church. Both are top down. What makes the Puritans at Plymouth so different is that they are bottom up. They are what we call latitudinarian. They were congregational. Their governance was bottom up. So first pillar is a Christian, mostly Protestant religious tradition. Second pillar that Jamestown did not have was common law. The Pilgrims, before they even get off the Mayflower, had a problem. First of all, they were off course, which meant that theoretically they were in defiance of the king and could be called traitors and could be killed. Second of all, half their number was not of the Puritan faith. They were what they called strangers. Now, I don't know what religion they were. Some were probably Anglican, some of others, but they weren't Puritans. And so, third of all, they had no government. They did not arrive with a government from England. So they adopted common law, which is that God puts the law in the hearts of the people, and the people elect or select rulers who will carry out that law. Okay. In the Middle Ages, all law was top down. It was divine right of kings. God put the law in the hand of the king, and he dispensed it downward. So right off the bat, you have 2 elements in Plymouth that are not present in Jamestown, which is why Plymouth is American exceptionalism, the epitome of American exceptionalism, and Jamestown is not. Third one, later, both of these got this, so it applies to both of them, which is private property with written titles and deeds. And the fourth one is free market economy, which doesn't appear really in Virginia as soon as it does in Plymouth. In Plymouth in 1630, it starts off right off the bat with they needed somebody to mill their corn and their grain. And they said, Farmer Jones, I forget his name. I'll have to look up this guy's name. But they said, if we empower you with food. If we pay you in food, will you spend full time grinding the food for all the rest of us, milling the food? And he said, yeah, division of labor, capitalism, free market enterprise. So Plymouth starts off with all four of the four pillars of American exceptionalism, which no other nation in the world has to this day, let alone has been born with it. Okay. So right off the bat, the 1619 project is hokum. It's it's urinal cover. It's a useless spooge,
Larry, what you just said right there, what you just broke down, it's gold. It's history gold, because this idea, and I said this before in the last hour, this idea, how we developed capitalism, the free market here, it's like nobody understands. I wonder how many people in their library at home right now have like the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism on the shelf, right? It's a major problem. And also, again, what you brought up, I mean, this marriage of common law, the Protestant ethic, this is something that if you don't know, it's easy for people like Hannah Jones to like really just obscure the timeline, to the point where everything is, and I think that other historian made a good point, everything in their mind is like antebellum South. And as one of the viewers even said, there was only 2 colonies who rejected abolition of slavery at the Continental Congress. That's it. So this idea that she makes the argument that the northern colonies, their economies would have collapsed if slavery was abolished before the revolution. Do you agree with that statement?
No,
like Massachusetts?
That's utter nonsense. These colonies were thriving. Now, it is true that by the time of the Civil War, which is, of course, 160 years later, you do have a cotton economy in which the South, the 11 states of the Confederacy, were wealthier than the North, but only because you add in land value and a purported value of slaves. That's absolutely true. But the land was only as good as the slaves. But in the colonial times that we're talking about, the northern colonies were vastly wealthier in terms of merchant trade and production and industrialization. But here's the thing that people like this Yahoo overlook, okay? Prior to the arrival of slaves here, there were 60 to 80,000 Irish white slaves that were brought into the Caribbean. At one time, the dominant form of slavery in the Caribbean was whites, not only Irish, but kids and vagabonds, vagrants, taken off the streets of London and other major cities and just say, hey, we're going to arrest you, but your arrest ended up putting you on a boat to the Caribbean where you were worked as an indentured servant. Now, here's point number 2. Any study, whether it's David Bryan Davis's multiple books, whether it's Edmund Morgan's great book, American Slavery, American Freedom, everybody should read that, about Virginia, whether it's Time on the Cross, no matter what book you look at that deals with slavery, most of them will admit that from 1619 until about 1670 or 80, in the minds of magistrates, judges, and others who enforced the law in all the colonies, there was no difference in practical, underline the word practical, status of a slave and an indentured servant. Morgan goes on to point out that many of the indentured servants had their indentures changed just like that, for talking back to the master, for attempting to run away, for not doing a job well. And the result of all of this was that essentially indentured servants were slaves. Yes, they could marry, but they couldn't afford to marry, so that really didn't matter.
So what's the point? Right.
They were treated under the law the same as slave in terms of being treated by the master, in terms of whether you could beat an indentured servant, beat a slave, on and on and on and on. So what people like Jones want to overlook is the fact that for the first 50 years, there essentially in practical treatment was no different between black and white. It was only about after 1660 or 70 that you started to get real racial differences in saying, well, this person is a slave and that person is an indenture, because the practice of indentures began to wear off for a whole bunch of reasons. And by the 1680s or 90s, much of indentured servitude in America was gone and had been replaced with slavery in the South. But by the 1700s, all sorts of states began efforts to completely eliminate slavery. And I think Vermont was the first one to do so and abolish slavery in 1792. Could be earlier in some other cases. New York and other states had already passed laws saying, well, you may be a slave, but your children are no longer going to be slaves. You didn't have hereditary slavery. It was a slow process, but we're way ahead 90% of the rest of the world in abolishing slavery. Yes, the British managed to do it in the 1830s, only because there were no black people in Britain. You know, there were maybe 100 black people in all of England. All of the blacks are in the West Indies. All of the slaves are in the West Indies. And this only affected reasonably a handful of rich planters who could be overridden by the majority vote, as opposed to in America, where you had a major part of the country, roughly half the country, and you had about 1/3 of that half was slaves, and about, I don't know the exact percentage, but I would say probably 10 to 15% of the slave owners had maybe 50 slaves or more. You only had 5% that had more than 50 or 100 slaves. It was a small number that had big slave plantations, but a lot of people had one slave or one body servant. Now, the other thing that's overlooked is on the eve of the Civil War, slavery was rapidly becoming urbanized. You were starting to get slaves working in factories, and they would get an actual salary, and they would bring that salary home and give it to their master. And usually these slaves were allowed to keep some and buy their own freedom. It's called manumission. However, as once the slave trade was cut off, okay, a good thing, right? But when you cut off the slave trade, what happens to the value of all existing slaves? It goes up because the number is smaller. They're not being replaced.
Yep.
So there were a lot of conflicting things going on as to how you achieved abolition. But the U.S. was still on the cutting edge of abolition, the first abolition society in the world. The Constitution is a model document for abolition because it didn't even use the word slavery. It said unfree persons. So they're people. They aren't property. And when the anti-slave elements, when the anti-slave elements got a hold of that concept in about the 1830s and ran with it, they said, wait a minute, we don't need to change the Constitution. It's right there in the Constitution. There is no slavery. There are only people in temporary conditions of bondage. And so beginning in the 1830s, and there's a great new book out there by a guy named Oakes, Stephen Oakes, O-A-K-E-S, called Freedom National. And beginning in the 1830s, the strategy was to enforce the Constitution by making freedom national. It was the default. Slavery was local. And what they were trying to do peaceably was to build a wall around the South, what was called a cordon of freedom, that would put so many stresses on the South, whether from runaway slaves or from difficulties trading with northern banks or whatnot, that eventually the South would see its way to begin to abolish slavery. And of course, that didn't.
Yeah, this is what I was going to ask you, and you got to it, but that was going to be my next question. They act like, you know, the language that these men used from even the Declaration, but of course, then when you codify the Constitution, as if that's an accident that they did it that way, Larry, as if they didn't realize when they were writing it what it would mean later, and there's a letter that John Adams writes to Abigail Adams, I brought up before. And, it's proof that they knew this when they were debating it, that they just didn't want to upend the order at that moment. Adams was very concerned. He's writing because Abigail's busting his chops over women rights too, like, while you're on the topic, John, and he's like, woman, all right, you're going to tear the society apart if we go too fast. But that's, to me, again, proof that they obviously knew what they were doing. They were planting those seeds to begin with. They just knew that, it was a delicate alliance with the South, with independence, and that obviously they would have to move kind of slow on this thing. But, what are your thoughts when, every President's Day comes around? There's always these people on Twitter. Why do we celebrate these racist slaveholders? Is it even fair, Larry? Look what Washington did, right? Jefferson was well liked. Is it even fair that to look at it that simple, right? Or these men were like products of their time, So is it even fair to look at even the slaveholding ones and condemn them for this during this period? How expensive it was to free a slave, Larry, and yet Washington still did what he did. So to me, it's like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, ideals are one thing, and it's important to understand that virtually no American founder saw slaves as anything other than humans. None of them treated slaves the way the Muslims did and immediately castrated all the young boys for military service, right? None of them treated them the way the Chinese did. Which if a slave ran away in China, they not only killed the slave when they caught him, they killed every member of his family, extended family, even those who weren't slaves. So when you're looking at these individuals, people like Jefferson, there's all sorts of biographies of Jefferson and his struggles with this. And he did struggle with it. And personally, he was a guy who was in a lot of debt. This guy was one of the most brilliant people in the world. It's the old thing, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? He was one of the most brilliant people in the world, but he couldn't figure out a way to make a profitable business, even with slave labor, which says a lot. I mean, you got to be pretty bad not to be able to make a living when all your slave, right? And people like Washington, who would go out and literally work with the slaves in the fields. So there was a tension. Of course, there was a tension that these people saw the fact that they owned slaves as problematic, but at the same time, they understood that they'd be broke if they didn't have the slaves, and there was no mechanism at the time for them to responsibly get rid of slavery in their own families and not be totally destitute. Now, you have to also understand that part of this, and there's a great new book by Wood, whom you mentioned already, called The Radicalism of the American Revolution.
Fantastic.
Great book that talks about how the idea of a person, and this is what led to abolition too, this feeds into abolition, but it's slow. These ideas are slow, but the idea was that a person has a right to life, liberty, and property. Well, okay, we know about life. We know about liberty. What did they mean by property? Well, in the late 1700s, it came to be understood that the most important property anybody could own was themselves, their own body, my body, myself, that kind of thing, right? And so increasingly, as Wood points out, this began to change attitudes towards slavery. Because if a person is entitled to their own body, you can't make that body a slave of someone else. Now, two other major things that people need to understand when talking about slavery in America. First, 1785. Those of you who are chronologically minded would realize that this is before the Constitution, right? This is the Land Ordinance of 1785. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that established private property rights in America nationally. And what does the ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 say? It says that there would be no slavery in the Northwest Territories. So the very first major act, well, second, the second major act of the Continental Congress, known as the Articles of Confederation Congress, was to abolish slavery in an entire set of territories that today constitute Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. And more important, because this was the first ever territorial expansion, this laid down the foundation that there would be no slavery in the territories. So how did we end up with any slavery in the territories, as in Texas or in Missouri or in Arkansas, for example? Well, that came later as they were debating the balance between the slave states and the free states. And the slave states said that, with the Louisiana Purchase, everything above Missouri, all new states that would come into the Union had to be free. Now, just think of that. That meant, I'll use today's states, okay? That meant that Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and at that time, part of Oregon, all in Colorado, all had to be free. All had to be free. What could choose slavery? Only a little teeny slice of Arkansas and Oklahoma. So the whole basis of the Missouri Compromise was such that from that point on, the Northwest Ordinance was going to be the rule to guide America past Missouri. We'll admit Missouri is a slave state only to balance Maine as a free state, but after that, everything above this is going to be free. That's astounding. So then comes Texas. Well, of course, there's a big fight over Texas and whether or not, most of the Whigs in the North, like Abraham Lincoln, opposed admitting Texas to the Union precisely because of slavery. They said, well, sure, we want the territory, but we don't want to have another slave state in it. Can you imagine that at the time they were willing to forego what is today the modern state of Texas because it had slaves in it? And eventually, of course, there was a compromise worked out called the Compromise of 1850, and California was admitted as a free state. Some might doubt that today because it's a radical communist state today. At the time, it was admitted as a free state, and the territories of Utah and New Mexico, and it contained Arizona, would be admitted on the basis of popular sovereignty, and they both chose freedom, right? So basically, the whole map of the United States, except for Missouri and except for Texas, was designed to be free. That's freedom national, slavery local.
Yeah, I got it. The other thing, that's amazing history lesson, but this is stuff that gets left out, as does like the Reconstruction era. People know the term Reconstruction, Larry, but for these people, for their version of history, and I think the other historian makes a good point. Every label on every decade is virtually the same. And they love leaving out the Reconstruction to Jim Crow era because it really shows their culpability, Larry. I mean, this is the legacy of the Democratic Party, that in Reconstruction, the rise of Redeemer governments, which would then implement Jim Crow. After the Civil War, what was it really like before Jim Crow for Black Americans in this country? I mean, it was not obviously ideal, but was it still antebellum South?
Okay, well, now we can't let you go with that because I've got to start. I have to always remind everybody when you talk about the Democratic Party, the Democrat Party was created for one purpose.
That's
only,
true. I know.
To protect and preserve slavery. It was set up by Martin Van Buren because he saw a civil war in the future if the North, with all these newly populous and wealthy states, began to act on slavery. He says, oh no, we've got to protect and preserve slavery, and we will do that through a brand new party created in the 1820s called the Democrat Party, which I spell with KKK, the Democrat Party, because it was started to protect and preserve slavery with a good intention, that is to avoid a war, but nevertheless, the way in which they did it was by rewarding supporters with money, with the patronage system, with the spoil system,
patronage,
by giving them all sorts of jobs and making them happy. Okay, don't forget your wallet here, Billy. I know you don't like slavery, but just remember who's paying the bills. And that was how they operate. And unfortunately, it's now created all sorts of other problems for America with the rise of the deep state, which is thoroughly related to the creation of the spoil system. But so let me now jump.
It's still here, Larry. It's still here.
So after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, what did the Union do? They sent in troops and said, now you guys make sure that blacks aren't harassed, that they get to vote, that they're not treated like slaves, that they have reasonable work contracts, and that there's no new slavery going in. And what did the Democrats do? The Democrats tried to pass black codes, which were the codes that said, if we can't determine that you're working the way we think you ought to be working, we're going to call you a vagrant and thereby legally ship you off to a work gang, which we would call slavery. So they were trying to reimpose slavery through the black codes. And again, first Grant, well, actually it was throughout Grant's administration. It would have been Lincoln, but of course he was killed. But Grant's administration said, that's not going to fly. And the radical Republicans, whom I used to not like very much, but over the years, I've come to really appreciate people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. And people like
Thaddeus, amazing character.
And so they all said, the South is still in rebellion. We have to go in there and slap them around a little bit more because they are not, obeying by the terms of their surrender and the 13th Amendment, which is why they had to go on and pass the 14th Amendment. We really should not have a 14th Amendment. We should need the 14th Amendment. Yeah. We have the Bill of Rights and we have the 13th Amendment, but we have the 14th because these yahoos, these Billy Bobs in the South, these Democrats were not observing the 13th Amendment and applying the Bill of Rights to slaves, former slaves. And so it was the North trying to keep them from being re-enslaved in a variety of ways.
Do you think things would have been, and I've talked about this a lot, do you think things would have been different had Lincoln not been killed? Of course they would have been, but how do you think that is? So later, and you bring up Thaddeus Stevens, that's a great character to bring up. So, later these people started to advocate for, punishing the South for not, going along with certain parts of Reconstruction. And as somebody who's raised in the North, you never hear this side of the story, Larry. It wasn't until I was in the Army and this girl took me on a tour of Savannah and showed me the burned stone from, yeah. And then you realize, oh, wow, there's a whole history here, that we're all blind to. And it really gets you thinking, because Lincoln wanted to bring embrace these people again. And you got to wonder whether or not that would have fostered some kind of goodwill, even though he was largely hated, throughout the South. What do you think? I mean, what do you think Lincoln could have or would have done differently? I mean, we ended up in the hands of a crook,
That's a great question. And he had basically 4 more years. How would he have responded, for example, to the black codes? And my concern is that Lincoln, because he wanted so badly to reunite the country, he wanted the Southerners to come back in on a peaceful and humane basis, and they just weren't doing that. And the malice toward none, charity for all kind of comment. And my fear was, libertarians and right-wing kind of, I'll say extremists, want to say that Lincoln was a tyrant and he was this evil guy, he did all these terrible things. It was wartime. It was wartime. You win the war, then you worry about the other stuff. I give FDR the same break when it came to interning Japanese. I know Barnes and I wouldn't agree on this, but you win the war first and then you worry about the other stuff. I'm sorry. For winning wars comes first. I think that in one way, Lincoln's mercy and good-naturedness might have tempered some of the problems in the South. On the other hand, I think his mercy and good-naturedness might have not proven hard enough. I don't think we were hard enough on the South in retrospect. My solution was drastically different than Lincoln's. Had I been president, I would have said, okay, all of these people are traitors. They are all treasonous. And therefore, you can take whatever property you want and so on and so forth. Then after the war, I would have been magnanimous and pardoned almost all of them. And see, if you had done it that way, you could have taken the property of the slave owners, redistributed it to the slaves without any constitutional issue. But because Lincoln did it a different way, it would have been unconstitutional to take the land of the slave owners and give it away. So as a result, we had a half measure, which was called sharecropping. And under sharecropping, the former plantation owners had the land and they had some implements, but they had no labor. The sharecroppers, the former slaves, had labor, but they had no land or implements. So they agreed to share the crop, usually about 40-60 in favor of the employee, the worker. But the workers also had to provide the seed, which later became a big issue because getting seed at the beginning of every planting season wasn't cheap. So to answer your question, Rich, I don't know. There are aspects of Lincoln that I think would have been too merciful for what needed to happen. I think actually the South got off easy. And of course, when Reconstruction was over and the Union troops were pulled out, they went right back to the same tactics and traits that they had been using for the previous 30 years. Now, I say that understanding people's biases and racial prejudices aren't going to change overnight. I get that. I understand that. How much could be expected to change? I don't know. It took them about 60 years after Reconstruction to finally change. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that's an interesting take, actually. You know, that Lincoln may have been too lenient. You know, I never, you know, I mean, I guess I've thought of it. I just never thought of it that way. But, you know, to answer somebody, there's a conversation going back and forth on locals. Jefferson, the party was called Jeffersonian Republicans. They were Jeffersonian Republicans. I think somebody's confusing Jefferson with Jackson when it comes to the Democratic Party. Yeah. So the modern Democratic Party, I think they're confusing Jefferson with Jackson.
Let me quickly explain this. So you had the Federalists, who used to be called the Nationalists till they figured out the name Federalist was better PR. So they changed the name to Federalist. Right. And that made the other side be the anti-Federalist. And in terms of public relations and marketing, you never want to be anti, right? So the Federalists figured that out.
What are you for? Not against something. What are you for? Right.
And so Jefferson and later Madison, Monroe, and the others became known as the Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists faded out after the War of 1812. They literally were dead as a party. And many of your viewers might not know that, you know, they joke about us having a uniparty today, right? There was literally a uniparty from 1816 to 1824, and it was the Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, as they would call themselves. But the new party that Martin Van Buren created had nothing whatsoever to do with the Jeffersonian Republicans. It was a brand new party called the Democrat Party, and it would later be aligned against the Whigs who drifted into the Republican Party. So that's why we call it the second American party system, is it has no relation whatsoever to the first.
You know, I got to ask you this, you know, because it's central to their claim in 1619 and the economic order of things. Isn't this completely backward, Larry? Wouldn't it have been economically risky for the Southern colonies to sign on to independence because of the slave trade? They made money, you know, through the crown. So it doesn't. I'm having a hard time understanding their logic. You know what I mean? The trade with Britain, and of course Britain's vast, you know, empire at the time, the exports that the South had going out would have all been at risk if they voted for independence. Right. So their argument's backward, isn't it? Isn't it just it's completely backward?
This goes to the whole argument by Wood in the book that you just showed on the radicalism of the American Revolution.
That's a great book.
Even in the South, the notion of personhood had already pretty much triumphed. You didn't have, I can't think of anybody in the South in the 1840s or 50s who still thought that slaves were anything but people. So yes, the South did work against its own interests in opposing England. They were getting the results, the favorable trade policies, the benefits of a Royal Navy that protected the slave trade and so on and so forth. But remember, already they were coming under a movement in England to get rid of the slave trade, and this is part of what infused the whole Napoleonic Wars, and the Congress of Vienna was they kept trying to push abolishing the slave trade into the Congress of Vienna and all that kind of stuff. So there was a movement already going on in England that was saying we're going to get rid of this slave trade at some time.
Larry, it's 2:01. We're going to wrap up, but I can't thank you enough, Larry, for coming on, especially in such short notice. Tell people where they could go to check out your stuff. Wild World of History is awesome. The Patriots history is, somebody brought up Howard Zinn, which is why I was like, oh, I got to talk to Larry, because he was going unanswered there for a while until honestly, there were others academically, but nobody got nobody got the notoriety that you did. You had the profile, like, this is the answer. But tell people where to go. You have so much out there. By the way, for people who don't know, Larry, you're still, as far as I know, you're still the only historian to get basically unfettered access to Reagan's library. Are you not? Is that still a running record?
Oh, other people can get it. They just didn't use it. But Reagan's library, the papers are out there, and they're open. And when I went out there, virtually no other scholars had been on the sign-in list. I understand Brands went in for like 1 or 2 days. But anyway, you can get Patriots History of the United States at my website, thewildworldofhistory.com, or on Amazon. We have a special offer on our website of Patriots History and the Patriots History Reader autographed and shipped for, I think it's $79, which is awesome. I also have, if you're an instructor, a teacher, a homeschooler, we have a full curriculum for U.S. history and a full curriculum for world history that includes workbooks, teacher's guide, tests, a built-in AP track, and me teaching the entire book in video. So you'll want to check out all the stuff on wildworldofhistory.com. And then, Rich, I've got a big announcement. I can't tell you now, but I'm going to have a big announcement in March about a big change in where we're going with Wild World of History and some other stuff.
That's a tease, but let us know when you do. We'd be happy to talk about it with you. Absolutely. Keep us posted. Thanks as always, Larry. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day, brother.
Bye.
That's Larry Schweikert, ladies and gentlemen. That was awesome that he came by. Wild World History is really cool. PragerU has him do videos too. So if you can see his style and how he goes through it, he brought up the Puritans and their economic system. And I know I've seen John Stossel write articles like this. We did in People's Pundit Daily. But Larry is the PragerU video that John Stossel would later use to explain when the Puritans got here. Like Larry said, they did not come with anything but a charter. They had no government. They had no system. And because of that charter, their first inclination was to try a collective system, right? A leftist system. And they damn near died and starved to death. So eventually they adopted, they did it quickly because they were not going to last very long. But eventually they adopted what we now know to be the modern free market, because it was more conducive with the Protestant ethic. And I get Larry, he gets this. So I can't explain this enough. And I know some people out there that always feel like I'm attacking them when I bring up the Protestant ethic. Maybe they're Catholic, right? Or Lutheran, or who knows, right? Or there's something, but they're not. Look, Larry was saying in the Anglicans, they weren't part of mainline Protestantism, like the Puritans would later become, Congregationalists would become. But that's not, same thing with Catholics. Don't feel attacked. Like my grandfather came here. He's still, I assume, the American identity. He was a Roman Catholic, but he practiced the Protestant ethic because it's part of the national identity. So I don't mean that as if like you have to be Protestant, because there were different denominations, though mostly they were Protestant. And in The Glorious Cause, what's amazing about what Robert Middlecoff does, like Larry was saying, there are certain elements to American exceptionalism. And in my book, I say there are elements to the American national identity, right? There's ideological origins. What everyone's trying to do is wrap up these concepts that do make America what it is, what different. And Larry, is saying exceptional. And that's the Protestant ethic, common law, right? And Middlecoff focuses a lot on the Protestant ethic. Bernard Bailyn wraps them all together and says, at the heart of all of this, these are the three pillars that come down. Larry talks about the four pillars of American exceptionalism. This is something that really we can never, ever forget. And Middlecoff will say that the desire for independence, right? Support is what he's basically saying. The push for independence was strongest, meaning the population supported it the most, where Protestant zeal burned most fierce. And they would literally be taverns where there would be rumblings of, the damn Pope. They get people in what is now part of French Canada, right? And they're trying to subvert us, and they got their hooks in the crown now, and they got the hooks in the English crown, and they have a bunch of people they control in Parliament, and there's all the papacy. It's a papal conspiracy. They did, it's some funny stuff to read, and some of it you got to wonder can't be that untrue. The papacy was always trying to undermine the Church of England. So it can't be that too far off. But Middlecoff says, there are conspiracies just like it out there today. But they were, this support for revolution, was most strong in these areas because that is obviously part, like Bailyn says, the ideological origins. That is what fueled these concepts, these ideas. And that book I put up with from Wood, Radicalism, by Gordon Wood, that is a fantastic book. And Larry brought it up for a reason. These were radical ideas for this time. Radical ideas. And to just discount them like, oh no, we went to war with the most powerful empire in the country to get independence over slavery, when it doesn't even there's no logical economic argument to back that up. And the northern colonies would not have been decimated economically if there was no slave trade. Yeah, there were things that obviously they got from the South that they would have had to pay more for. But that was, my God, come on. Why, by the way, Lexington and Concord happened where? Trace it back, like Larry was saying. Those were Congregationalists. They were the descendants of Puritans, and they had the strongest. Meanwhile, in places like Virginia, the Anglican Church was very prominent. Jefferson, when he was in church, was like, I don't think he would have considered himself an Anglican, but Washington was definitely part of the church, the Anglican Church in Virginia. So they still, though, had these Protestant ethic concepts. And speaking of which, Larry said Jefferson struggled. There's one entry that I specifically cite Jefferson in Our Virtuous Republic. And what I'm trying to say is there was this revisionist movement from these very same people over the years to say Jefferson wasn't a religious man at all, and he didn't even believe in God. He was probably an atheist. There's a big difference between a deist and an atheist. And young versions of our founders, many of them in their writings, I did see very deist tendencies. And it's not that they don't believe in God. They were unsure about God interacting with the living world. So does God interfere in the affairs of men? And young versions of our founders very much doubted that to be the case, while older versions of our founders, as they aged, did no longer doubted that. And in one specific entry dealing with slavery, which I actually cite, Jefferson is lamenting. He's afraid. And he calls it supernatural retribution. He is afraid that the Creator is going to impose supernatural retribution on him from slavery, but he didn't have a pot to piss in. He had his land and he had his slaves, but Larry's right. He was not a good businessman, an inventor. He never really sold things. He did not benefit from them like Franklin would benefit from the parts of, his inventions, the press, the Franklin stove he gave away. But he didn't patent it or make money. But Franklin was a shrewd business guy and was able to make a lot of money. That was not Jefferson. So he very much struggled over it. And obviously, as most people believe, he was in love with one of his slaves. And I mean, it's hard to prove that. But when you look at the totality of their lives together, I don't know why, again, I said before, I don't know why Sally would not have just stayed in France. He gave her free, opened the door for her to walk out. He did. And she did not. She returned to him. So I think that's probably because there was a love story there. Why would Jefferson never be married, ladies and gentlemen? Why? Or never have his Abigail, right? Or his Martha. Very different situation. But yeah, all great stuff that we talked about today, all great books, but it is simply untrue that the revolution was fought because of slavery, to preserve slavery. It's nonsense, in fact. A lot of stuff, a lot of great comments, and a lot of you guys do understand that there is a history there that should not be forgotten, but that doesn't mean we need to malign our own history. And there's a lot of knowledge in these comments, so that's always makes me happy to see. So so many people know things, by the way, like that it was just Georgia and South Carolina that really objected to the abolition, right? Everyone else would have been pretty much okay with the path forward. When they use the word persons, right? Of course, they know what that meant legally and philosophically. And while Jefferson toned down the language in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, he later, who's sitting around that table? Franklin, Adams, right? And him being a slave owner. They had to get him to tamper down that language because they said this is going to be too open of a it wasn't just slaves, though, either. They were worried that it could be interpreted to mean, women, Native Americans. It would just be too many people who would say, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I can sign on to this. They needed to keep together this very loose coalition of colonies to make sure that they got that declaration voted, and passed. So, again, when you read this stuff yourself, you'll see it's very different than what's portrayed by the modern the New York Times, who 20, 30 years ago was saying you can't even understand the American Revolution unless you've read Bernard Bailyn. You can't understand it. Now they're not sponsoring a project that runs completely counter to the work he did, and it's sad. Because like Miss, and I'm sorry for forgetting your name, like Professor Harris wrote in her article in Politico, Professor Harris, again, not being a right-winger, being basically a left-wing historian who's focusing on Black history in early America, showing us that the New York Times simply didn't give a damn about the truth. And that's sad because some of the stuff that could have been a positive contribution from this project will now be lost in the sauce because it has been thoroughly discredited by making a claim that is such a big claim at the heart of the entire documentary, at the heart of the entire body of work that is not true. So that's not the critics' fault, though. I would argue with Miss Harris on this point. Professor, that's not the critics' fault. That is Miss Hannah Jones' fault. She should have done an honest body of work, and then it would have been taken seriously. But as it is right now, it's a work of propaganda, and it's absolutely tragic that once again, the Black community will be the one who suffers from the grift, which is what it is. All right. With that in mind, check out Larry's Wild World of History. Thanks again, Larry, for coming on at the last minute. That was awesome. I was trying to get David because David taught history. He was a historian. And then it dawned on me, oh my goodness, Larry. And I'm so happy that he was able to come by. All right, with that in mind, folks, I'm going to go. Don't forget, check it out on Locals. We talked about a lot today that we talk about during the book club. And for the book club people, this is the book. This is it. So maybe we'll do something next. We want to do something that has to do with not foreign policy. We took different take from the start of this because of when it started was the war in Ukraine. So we wanted to show different defensive realists versus offensive realists, while basically just showing how neoconservatism, neoliberalism is a joke. The democratic peace theory is a joke. And now we're going to back it up. And we're going to start with American history. And I don't know a better place to start than Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. Because from there, we can check out things like the Federalist Papers and not, big books. The book club is an enormous amount of information. One of the members yesterday who hadn't been able to join us, always watches the repeat, said that she thinks it's like taking a course in college. It's cool and it's fun though. It's not dry. It's fun, and you don't need the books. We're going to read them anyway. So I encourage you all to do it. You can listen in and then offer your thoughts. You don't have to participate. Of course, we'd love your questions at the end during discussion, but you don't have to. So don't think you'll ever be on the spot. It's worth hearing the information that we discuss in these book clubs. And that's Sundays, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, typically for local supporters. Check it out. Join the locals community at peoplespundit.locals.com, which is right there. If you like the video, like it, share it far and wide. Subscribe if you haven't already. YouTube, Rumble preferably, but YouTube, Rumble. And those of you watching on Getter, of course, you probably follow me already. Thanks for that. Check out the locals channel page below. All right, we'll see you Wednesday, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We have reclaimed our time slot, and we will be back. Thanks for watching, folks. All the best. Deuces.
How much you wanna bet that I can get you back inside your head before the summer ends and spread a little love. Just for a little fun, I'll make you come back to me before the rise of every sun. Baby, it's meant to be. I know you got a man, but he don't understand. You're gonna be a heartbreaker. You're such a love taker. So just suck me in and you can toss me like a cigarette. 'Cause I just wanna be a bad habit, yeah.
Welcome to Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit. And now here's your host.